Hey Fox, how you doing? So by now you probably know I'm a huge metal fan. Literally. But what you may not know, because I'm very, very discreet about it, is that I'm also a huge football fan. By the way, that's football and not football because I'm from North America. But anyways, I'm not sure how many of you watching know about sports at all, and even if you do, you're not tuning in to see me talk about sports. But don't worry, I'm going somewhere with this. So even if you're not a football fan, you probably still know the name Tom Brady. As you should. He's one of the biggest star athletes of the 21st century. He was married to the most popular supermodel in the world for a long time. To any non-sports fan, he's known as a football player. To any sports fan, he's known as the greatest quarterback of all time. He is the undeniable GOAT of football, and he started on this road to becoming the GOAT by taking over the Patriots' starting quarterback position in 2001 after the Patriots starter at the time got hurt. That starter's name was Drew Bledsoe.
A 3rd down and 10 now. Big play for the Patriots. Bledsoe gonna run it. Needs 10 yards.
Oh my. And the ball, they're going to actually, it looks like they're going to rule that a fumble. And oh, look at Drew.
This is now well known in the annals of sports. Drew Bledsoe took a monstrous hit by Mo Lewis and was knocked out of the game. In comes Tom Brady, and the rest is history. Drew Bledsoe himself has been forgotten in the history books outside of that one fateful moment, but what you may not know is that Bledsoe was also a really good quarterback. Drew Bledsoe was the first overall pick in 1993 for the New England Patriots. We now know the Patriots as arguably the greatest dynasty in sports of the 21st century, but it's almost forgotten about how bad they were before that happened. People think Tom Brady and Bill Belichick are what turned the franchise around, but it was actually Drew Bledsoe. In his second season, the New England Patriots, whom were a pathetic franchise for a long time, went 10-6 under Bledsoe's leadership and made the playoffs. In 1996, he was named to the Pro Bowl and they went all the way to the Super Bowl. They lost, but the Patriots had become a perennial contender by that point. He was so integral to the Patriots franchise that he signed a $103 million contract in the 2001 offseason, locking him up for the next 10 years, which is why it was so controversial for Belichick to keep Tom Brady in as the starter when Bledsoe was ready to come back from his injury. Of course, hindsight is 2020 and we all know it was the right choice, but at the time, it was a huge gamble, but it paid off. Brady went on to win the Super Bowl for the Patriots that year and won 5 more for the franchise. Meanwhile, Drew Bledsoe, while he had some success in Buffalo and Dallas after that, became washed up very quick and was out of the league by the end of the decade. Because of that injury, Bledsoe's potential Hall of Fame career was relegated to being an answer on a trivia question. So at the time, it was a risky move, but in hindsight, it was the right one. The story I'm telling you today is pretty much the death metal equivalent of that story. This is a story of a legendary death metal band and how they took one of the biggest risks a band has ever taken, how they decided to replace their iconic singer with an unknown. This is the story of how Corpsegrinder replaced Chris Barnes in Cannibal Corpse. To me, this is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of music. A story of a meteoric rise, a near cataclysmic fall, and a near seamless rebirth of the most iconic death metal band in the world. And, Mike. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. What the fuck do you want now, metal douche?
Why are you talking about this crap? Everybody knows Corpsegrinder replaced Chris Barnes in Cannibal Corpse. This isn't helping the scene grow.
Well, I always wanted to tell this story because it's always interested me, and...
I don't care. You talk about wanting metal to grow. Well, it's not gonna grow if you talk about a band that everybody knows about.
Look, dude, I just think this is a cool story to tell, and there's so many things about it that'll be fun to dive into.
Why don't you talk about more underground bands? Why don't you talk about things that people don't know about? Like this one band called Blow Dick and their album Cream Pie Lobotomy. You're such a fucking poser!
Holy fuck, metal dude, shut up. Okay, I know everyone in the metal community knows this story. I know it's been talked about a million times. I know it's something involving the biggest death metal band in the world. I know all of these things. But I want to tell this story because A, I want to tell it my way. B, there's a lot of moving parts in this story that the majority of metalheads don't know. And C, because it's an interesting story to tell, regardless of how many fucking times it's been told. If you or any of these Metal Archives dwelling mouth breathers are pissed off about that, please unsubscribe and go watch some other asshole who panders to you. Thank you, fuck you, bye.
Well, fuck you then, you fucking soy boy poser, false metal guzzling
Get lost, dipshit. Alright, can we stop wasting everyone's time now? Cannibal Corpse was a death metal band founded in 1988 in Buffalo, New York. This band was essentially an underground Buffalo metal scene supergroup that consisted of members of Tyrant Sin, and Beyond Death. From Beyond Death came guitarist Jack Owen and bassist Alex Webster, and from Tyrant Sin came guitarist Bob Rousset, drummer Paul Mazurkovich, and singer Chris Barnes. And before you all start commenting, yes, I know he was in Leviathan too. If I told you every little detail about this band's history, we'd have a 5-hour video. Pacing is a thing, people. They released their first demo in early 1989, which featured their first huge hit, A Skull Full of Maggots. The demo sold out of copies as it blew up in the Western New York area. By March of '89, they played their first gig. That same year, the fledgling death metal scene in America had begun to establish itself. Death released Scream Bloody Gore and Leprosy by that time, and Morbid Angel, Obituary, and Autopsy had released their debuts. But as that was going on, Cannibal Corpse's demo out in Buffalo had been making the waves in the American metal scene. By the end of that year, they had opened for Dark Angel and signed a record deal with Metal Blade Records after Vice President Mike Faley heard the demo. This was a huge step for Cannibal Corpse to get signed, and a huge step for Metal Blade as well, as they had no death metal acts on their roster at the time. But with Death, Morbid Angel, Obituary, and Autopsy taking off, Brian Slagle and Mike Faley must have known that the metal scene was going to pass them by if they didn't start picking up death metal bands quickly. And while it was a big step for Metal Blade, it was still a big risk. As you may know, death metal's epicenter at this time was Tampa, Florida. So if Metal Blade was going to sign a death metal band, it would only make sense that it would be an up-and-comer from the land of Devil Rays and Buccaneers, right? But they didn't. They decided to sign this band out of the armpit of New York State who, while they were local legends, were 2,000 miles away from the biggest and baddest death metal that was happening. This was a risky move on Metal Blade's part, so two things needed to happen. Metal Blade needed to give this band every opportunity they could to succeed, and Cannibal Corpse were going to have to bring their A game if they were going to have any shot at hanging with their already established death metal contemporaries. Metal Blade did their part. They gave them a good budget, set them up at now legendary Morrisound Studios in Tampa, and connected them with legendary producer in the making, Scott Burns. Now, it was up to Cannibal Corpse to deliver. If they shat the bed on this debut, their careers would be over before they even started, and Metal Blade's reputation might forever be tarnished. A lot was riding on this debut, and I'm happy to report that on August 17th, 1990, the risk paid off. This debut established Cannibal Corpse as one of the new kids on the death metal block. It displayed a frantic, angsty, unhinged version of death metal by a wide-eyed group of rookies who were still learning how to be professionals. Regardless of how green everything was, you could tell the talent was there. You heard it in the guitar playing. The drumming. And just the songwriting in general. You can even tell this was a band that was going to make something of themselves based on shock factor alone. The now iconic album cover of a zombie eating his own guts drew a whole lot of attention for the band, and it made a lot of people want to check out the band based on the artwork alone, and what they got was everything I had just described, plus a raw guttural singer in Chris Barnes. With one album, Barnes himself became a death metal singer to watch out for in the scene, as his deep, hoarse, guttural style was only beginning to develop. Even though there was still a lot of room for improvement, Cannibal Corpse proved to Metal Blade that they made the right decision by signing them. That decision by Brian Slagle would only get better for his company as time went along, as all of the groundwork laid on this debut would be worked on and improved amazingly on their 1991 follow-up, Butchered at Birth. Back to Life was solid, but Butchered at Birth was a massive improvement in every way. Guitars, drums, bass, vocals, production. Even the artwork was way more brutal and shocking. Chris Barnes himself became even more guttural and brutal as a vocalist, as his low growling, unintelligible style pretty much reached an entire lower octave. The band was also starting to develop a style all to their own and were perfecting their amazing sense of groove. Overall, the biggest takeaway from this album, besides its amazing quality, is that this is a band that is always willing to improve themselves and always trying to be the best death metal band they could possibly be. And that drive was shown even more on the 1992 iconic death metal classic, Tomb of the Mutilated. This album seemed like a peak for the band. Everything about Tomb was darker, heavier, and more brutal than anything they had done previously, which says a lot. And the song titles were the edgiest they've ever been, with now iconic titles like Hammer Smashed Face, I Come Blood, Addicted to Vaginal Skin, Necropedophile, Postmortal Ejaculation, and of course, the legendary Entrails Ripped from a Virgin's Heck, even the album cover was more brutal and shocking than what came before. The first one had a zombie eating itself, the second one had zombies dissecting a dead baby, and this album cover had a dead, decomposing dude eating out a rotting dead girl with her guts hanging out. This artwork was so grotesque and shocking that some countries banned the album outright, but what kept standing out the most was the vocals. He's maligned now, but there was a time when Chris Barnes was one of the best death metal vocalists in the world. He had a low register guttural that was matched by few at the time, and while he wasn't the first death metal singer to sing that low, he popularized this style more than anyone before him. The only question was, as he got older, could his style and technique be sustainable? Anyways, it was obvious by this time that Cannibal Corpse had arrived. It was also obvious that, again, this was a band that was always trying to be the best death metal band they could be. They improved in a lot of ways over the course of their first 3 albums, but as time went on, they were starting to notice some potentially fatal flaws in their song composition, namely Bob Rousse's guitar playing. While he did bring a lot to the table in terms of energy and riffing in the beginning, it was becoming obvious as the rest of the band was improving as musicians that he was struggling to keep up. He did a lot for the band in the beginning, including coming up for the main riff of A Skull Full of Maggots. But his contributions to the music became smaller and fewer and far in between. The band started to gravitate more towards Alex Webster and Jack Owen's riff writing, and Rousset was getting relegated to soloing. And that, well... yeah, it wasn't the best. This potentially fatal flaw all came to a head when it came time to record the Hammer Smashed Face EP in '93. They were covering a few classic metal songs with this EP, and Rusey was in charge of some of the soloing. I can't play you his solos on the EP because the band found it so bad that Jack Owen re-recorded them. Regardless of how great of a guy Bob Rusey was and how much they were friends with each other, the band was at an impasse. By the time the Hammer Smashed Face EP was released, Cannibal Corpse had realized that, in order to be the best, they needed to make some tough decisions, even if those tough decisions included replacing band members. And by the end of 1993, they did exactly that. Bob Rusey was kicked out, and he was replaced by Rob Barrett. His style was a perfect fit for the band, as he was one of the most on-beat rhythm players in the extreme music underground at the time. This is obvious if you listen to his band Solstice. His sense of proficiency and tightness was a perfect match, and this is yet another move Cannibal Corpse made to become the best death metal band they could be. Unfortunately, this goal to be the best they could be took a step back with their next studio album, The Bleeding. While the album was still good, with standout tracks like the title track, Fucked with a Knife, and Stripped, Raped, and Strangled, it felt like everything had regressed. The production, for example, was way more muddled than on previous albums. It didn't pack the same punch that Tomb had, and it lacked the brutal buzzsaw atmosphere of Butchered. While there were some good songs like the ones I had mentioned, overall the songwriting just wasn't as consistent as it was on Tomb and Butchered and Eaten Back to Life. They always had a good sense of groove, but it felt on The Bleeding like they were relying too much on groove and forgot about the blazing speed and buzzsaw guitars that was also a huge part of their core sound. Another thing that stuck out like a sore thumb was Chris Barnes' vocals. He just doesn't seem to be pushing himself on this record. He's also way too quiet on this record, almost like he's trying to pull off some quiet, growling whisper, but instead of it coming off as powerful, it came off like he was trying to talk, but not talk loud enough that it wakes up his parents. It just felt like a massive regression and a huge step back after how brutal and powerful he was on the first three albums. There was also a certain bizarre vocal inflection that he was trying to do on this record. Now, this record was hugely successful. In fact, it's Cannibal Corpse's best-selling record in America to date. Unfortunately, The Bleeding's success essentially told Chris Barnes that what he was doing vocally was good, and it would eventually evolve into... oh no. Oh God. Oh dear God, no! Okay, let's talk about something else before I lobotomize myself. So let's flash back to 1991. While Cannibal Corpse was rising out of the Buffalo death metal scene, there was another small but important death metal scene emerging on the other side of New York State. This is what we call the New York City death metal scene, even though none of the bands I'm about to mention are actually from the city itself. Anyways, you had Incantation out of Fair Lawn, New Jersey, Immolation and Mortician out of Yonkers, New York, and out of Long Island you have arguably the most impactful band to come out of this scene, Suffocation. In '91, using the same studio and producer as Cannibal Corpse, Suffocation recorded their classic debut, Effigy of the Forgotten. This album has gone down as one of the best death metal debuts in history. I'm sure the average metalhead knows this, but what you might not know is that there was a certain guest vocalist on Effigy. Said guest vocalist appeared on the tracks Reincremation, and Mass Obliteration. This guest vocalist was a little-known singer out of Baltimore, Maryland by the name of George Fisher.
Fuck the Alliance! Fucking die, you fucking emo cocksuckers!
George Fisher was born on July 8th, 1970. He grew up a fan of hard rock, heavy metal, 80s hardcore, and the Denver Broncos. Ugh. But yeah, basically he grew up a metalhead.
My parents listened to music. They weren't like avid, like all day long listening to music, but they listened to it. And so I was familiar with all types of music. But when I heard Black Sabbath, that was the changing of everything. That's when I was like, that was the beginning of me wanting to be like, eventually my mentality being, I want to do this for my life.
According to this same interview, he started singing in order to try and replicate some of his favorite singers of his youth. And since most metal singers of the time had a gruff and raspy style of singing, his style became gruff and raspy. Eventually, he moved on to become a fan of early thrash, black and death metal like Slayer, Celtic Frost, Possessed, and Death, and he would try to replicate those styles the same way he tried to replicate Black Sabbath or Judas Priest. With all of these influences as a singer, he developed an eclectic style of guttural singing that was very precise and had a very wide range. In the super underground death metal scene, his talents would become apparent as he released a demo with his band, Corpsegrinder. That same year, he also released another demo. This one was with death metal's version of a farm team, Monstrosity. While these two demos were raw and greener than Augusta National in springtime, you could tell by listening to them that George had a lot of talent and a lot of potential. And since he was in Corpsegrinder, the other members of Monstrosity gave him the nickname of Corpsegrinder, which has now become iconic. After releasing a few singles over the next few years, they looked to make their full-length debut. And in 1992, as Cannibal Corpse was riding high after the release of Tomb of the Mutilated, Monstrosity, out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, freshly signed by Nuclear Blast Records, would walk into, you guessed it, Morrisound Studios to record their debut, Imperial Doom. With this album, and the aforementioned guest spot on Effigy, and his subsequent demo with Corpsegrinder titled Shadows in '93, George Corpsegrinder Fisher was showing the death metal world that he was a singer to be reckoned with. It just had to take another couple of years for anyone to start looking. You see, while Monstrosity was a good band, they never really caught on to the death metal scene the same way Cannibal Corpse or Morbid Angel or Obituary or Deicide did. We'll never really know why. Maybe it was bad timing, maybe it was bad promotion, or maybe it was just a bad location for the band, but it definitely wasn't because of bad music. Regardless, Monstrosity just never reached the heights that most of their Florida peers did, and because of that, George Fisher, while he was a promising singer with a ceiling that reached the stars, remained in relative obscurity. Fortunately for him, right around this time, Chris Barnes was starting a side project. No one knew it at the time, but this side project laid the foundation for George Corpsegrinder Fisher to get his opportunity. This Chris Barnes side project went by the name of 6 Feet Under. So, when I set out to make this video, I really wanted to dial the humor back from the previous Keeping Tabs video, the Seth Putnam documentary, and I wanted to make something that was more straightforward, more mature, more serious to a point. But unfortunately, there is only so much bad music that I can take. But I will soldier on through. I will keep the comedy bits, the anger, all of that Mad Mike stuff that you're used to a minimal throughout this entire segment, and speak about Chris Barnes and 6 Feet Under and Chris Barnes in 6 Feet Under in a very straightforward, mature manner. So with that being said, let's do this. Okay, so 6 Feet Under was this side project founded by Chris Barnes in 1993. He founded it because Cannibal Corpse was more of a democratized band where everyone had a say in how the music went. He wanted to be in a band where he could have full control and have his entire vision presented in the final product. Cannibal Corpse was not that band for him. Thankfully for him, 6 Feet Under was. While he was still in both bands at the time, it was becoming clear that he began to favor 6 Feet Under, and understandably so. At the end of the day, he is an artist, and artists want full control over their vision. Even if that vision is dog shit. Fuck. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. So if I were to describe 6 Feet Under to a non-death metal fan, they are kind of like a death metal version of an alternative rock or post-grunge band, something like Godsmack or Mudvayne. Basically, he kept the brutal lyrics he was known for in Cannibal Corpse, but he turned down the beats per minute and turned up the groove. And thankfully for Barnes, this style of death metal filled a void in the death metal scene, and Haunted was a relatively big hit, with songs like Human Target, The Enemy Inside, and Lycanthropy. This album put 6 Feet Under on the death metal map very quickly. The subsequent tour in support of this album was also a massive success and showed that 6 Feet Under wasn't just some side project for Barnes. This was a band that was here to stay. But at this time, Chris Barnes was still the singer of Cannibal Corpse, and they had a record that they needed to finish. And with that, the stage was set for the most pivotal change in death metal history. The year is 1996. Cannibal Corpse was in the studio recording their 5th studio album, Created to Kill. 6 Feet Under had just released Haunted in September of 95 and had a very successful tour in support of the album. George Fisher was recording vocals for the next Monstrosity album titled Millennium. By the end of that year, all 3 of these bands would change forever. Let's start with Cannibal Corpse. According to the documentary Centuries of Torment, everything except the vocals and guitar solos had been recorded. They were essentially just waiting on Barnes to come back from his 6 Feet Under tour to finish the record. That being said, they were unhappy with what Barnes had been laying down beforehand, and they weren't big fans of the vocal direction he was taking. I mean, if you listen to the demo for Devoured by Vermin, you could probably see where they're coming from. And it's not even the whole birth of... It's just that the song feels disjointed. It feels like the vocals are doing something completely different from the song, which, to be fair, that's an accurate artistic expression of where the band was at the time. Cannibal Corpse and Chris Barnes seem to be 2 different entities at this point. And we're not just talking about music either. This schism between Barnes and the rest of the band had been building for years. Barnes is a strong personality and is 100% confident in his vision for what the band should be. Not only that, but since he was the singer, and at the time a very iconic death metal singer at that, he was becoming the face of the band. This led him to be essentially above the band. And for a heavily democratized band like Cannibal Corpse, this pedestal was unsustainable. Now, in all fairness, there absolutely was jealousy of Barnes on the part of the other members. Jack Owen admits as much in Centuries of Torment.
Being frontman and doing all the interviews, probably a little jealousy on our part built up over the years, and you know, we had our vision of what the band should be and what it should evolve to, and he had another idea of kind of making it his own thing.
And that did not help matters at all as far as the music side of things were concerned. This all came to a head when Barnes was getting ready to lay down his vocals for Created to Kill, and the rest of the band didn't like what he was doing. And so they started giving him orders on how to record his vocals, and they started trying to contribute lyrically in order to fit the rest of the band's vision more. This was potentially the final straw for both parties. Barnes did not want to be told what to do, and the rest of the band did not want to be ruled over by one person. In layman's terms, both sides were sick of each other's shit. And you know what? I can see where each side is coming from. Cannibal Corpse considered themselves to be a band run by every member for every member, and Barnes had his own way of doing things and didn't like his vision to be trampled on. But at the end of the day, Cannibal Corpse was not Chris Barnes, and Chris Barnes was not Cannibal Corpse. And because of that, the band had reached a breaking point. Keep in mind though, this band was in the prime of their career. They had 4 successful albums under their belt, and their most recent release was one of the most commercially successful albums in death metal history, and they were expected to top that with their next release. The pressure to be even heavier and nastier than they ever were before was at an all-time high. This was not a good time for the band and its singer to be at odds with each other, and it sure as hell was not a good time for the band to get rid of what was essentially their leader and their face. But that is exactly what Cannibal Corpse did. In early 1996, Barnes was future endeavored by the band, and that gave the metal world a Tsar Bomba-sized shockwave, from the Cannibal Corpse fan base to the metal community, and even Metal Blade kingpin Brian Slagel, who must have known what was going on behind the scenes and must have seen this coming. And this response was, well, human. Just like any other kind of divorce or breakup or firing or resignation, even if you see it coming, it's still a surprise to see it actually happen. Nevertheless, the fact remains that Chris Barnes was out right as the band was peaking, and Cannibal Corpse were going to have to answer for making what was considered by many to be a horrible decision. Thankfully for them though, they knew what they were doing, and they had an ace up their sleeve. That ace was none other than George Corpsegrinder Fisher. As recording for Monstrosity's sophomore effort Millennium had just wrapped up, George Fisher received a phone call from Alex Webster. This phone call was a request for Fisher to join Cannibal Corpse as their new singer, and Fisher was more than happy to say yes. Cannibal Corpse was happy they got their guy, George Fisher was happy that he was joining the biggest death metal band in the world, but the reaction from everyone else was, well, pretty mixed. You see, if you were well versed in the death metal scene at the time, you knew who George was. He had a guest spot on one of the biggest death metal debuts of all time, and he had perfected his singing chops over the course of a few demos and Monstrosity's debut. If you heard the guy sing, you knew he was right for the job. But at the same time, this was 1996. This was pre-internet times. You couldn't just go on Spotify and type in Monstrosity and learn who George Fisher was. You couldn't go on Wikipedia and learn that he was already a death metal veteran who understood the game very well. TLDR, while the diehard death metalers knew him, the casual listener had no fucking clue. And since human beings fear what they don't know, he was subject to a lot of controversy just for being hired as a replacement for their hero. But Corpsegrinder knew he was going to face this controversy, and he also knew how he was going to overcome it, by singing his heart out. Cannibal Corpse as a whole were no stranger to controversy either. They were pissing off a lot of people with their music and artwork, their music was getting banned in many parts of the world, and 1996 Republican US presidential candidate Bob Dole himself was trashing the band publicly.
I'm talking about groups like Cannibal Corpse, Ghetto Boys, and Two Live Crew. About a culture, business that makes money from music, which extols the pleasure of raping, torturing, and mutilating women. From songs about killing policemen and rejecting law. The mainstreaming of deviancy must come to an end.
Spoken like a true Freemason. So where was I? Oh yeah, the band was no stranger to controversy, and they were no stranger to replacing band members. It was the same thing on paper, but in the real world, it was way different. Chris Barnes was not Bob Rousset. He was the lead singer of the biggest death metal band in the world, and one of the premier frontmen in all of metal. Internally though, there was no tension at all. The band made the right decision in their eyes, and George Fisher was joining the band of his dreams. All they could do at this point was just keep doing what they were doing, and that was making good music. And that's exactly what they got back to doing when the dust had settled. They re-entered the studio, changed the album title to Vile, and brought George behind the mic to record his vocals. Cannibal Corpse's 5th studio album, Vile, was complete. They were excited for it, death metal fans were cautiously optimistic, Metal Blade was nervous, the casual metalhead was ready to hate listen, and the Backstreet Boys were releasing their debut. Okay, got off track there, but Vile was ready to be released, and the first track off the album was Devoured by Vermin. For many death metal fans, this was going to be the first time George Corpsegrinder Fisher was going to be heard. A lot was riding on this album. Cannibal Corpse's legacy was on the line, Metal Blade's reputation was on the line, George Corpsegrinder Fisher's career was on the line, and the entire metal community was waiting with bated breath. On May 21st, 1996, Vile was released to the public, and Corpsegrinder was unleashed upon the entire metal world. His moment had arrived. One scream, Corpsegrinder and Cannibal Corpse silenced all the doubters and crushed all the naysayers. They proved to the world that they made the right choice, and George Fisher himself proved that he was the man for the job, and the result was a huge success. The album was acclaimed by critics and fans, and it became the first death metal album to appear on the Billboard 200. It debuted at number 151 and has since gone down as a classic in death metal history. Once again, Cannibal Corpse had the weight of the entire world on their shoulders, and once again, they answered the bell. For my money, this is one of the greatest stories of risk-taking and perseverance in the history of music. This move should have blown up in their face. They turned their backs on their legendary vocalist and was even the designer of their original logo in favor of a guy who was all neck and no face. This absolutely should not have worked, but it did. They took a risk. A huge risk, and it paid off in spades. By the end of 1996, the death metal landscape as a whole had changed completely. David Vincent had left Morbid Angel after 4 iconic albums. Chuck Schuldiner, who was getting more and more alienated by the death metal scene, founded the prog metal band Control Denied. But most famously, Corpsegrinder replaced Chris Barnes in Cannibal Corpse, which was an overwhelming success, while Chris Barnes himself became devoted to 6 Feet Under full-time and began to carve out his, well, niche. 6 Feet Under, for whatever you want to say about the quality of the music, has been an incredibly successful band. Not only that, but Chris Barnes, whether I like to admit it or not, proved that he could be just as successful on his own as he was in Cannibal Corpse. The band has released 16 studio albums since 1995 and are still one of the biggest names in death metal today. Even if the quality of said albums are... well, there is no fucking quality. Okay. Not the biggest fan of them, okay? But regardless of what you may think of 6 Feet Under, you can't deny that time has been much kinder to Cannibal Corpse. The further away we get from this moment, the more it looks like Cannibal Corpse made the right decision. They're still a band that pushes themselves, and they are still driven to be the best death metal band they could be. Since Vile's release in 1996, they have released 11 more studio albums, and the quality of those albums have been consistently great. Some are better than others, of course, but overall, they're still pumping out gold to this day, and that's an amazing thing to say about a death metal band in their 50s. While their first 4 albums with Barnes were definitely iconic and groundbreaking, to me, they became a better and more dynamic band when Corpsegrinder became their new singer. His range, his charisma, and his stage presence were all way better than Barnes, and they became a much more well-rounded band because of it. On the other side of this, while Chris Barnes is still performing with 6 Feet Under, he has become a shell of himself. From his Twitter bio that reads, "Cannibal Corpse changed their name to 6 Feet Under," to his rant a few years back about how death metal singers aren't good anymore, to, well...
hanging from the rope, the body just twitches there.
Yeah, Mr. Barnes, Cannibal Corpse replacing you was the best decision they ever made. When I set out to tell this story, I thought I was telling a metal story. But as time went on and I let all of this research settle into my brain, I realized I was writing a sports story that just happened to involve a death metal band. The parallels are all there. Talent that refuses to work on their craft, risky moves that pay off, decisions that are second-guessed, triumph over adversity. This story of Corpsegrinder replacing Chris Barnes has all of that. But Even though I felt like I was telling a sports story that happened to involve a death metal band, that idea began to fall apart in my head, because the main villain in any sports story is time. So, in order for this analogy to make sense, time needs to be that villain for Cannibal Corpse. But it hasn't been. Even though, on paper, they should be a bunch of tired old men who can't play death metal anymore, they're still defying Father Time and going strong. Some might argue they've only gotten better with age. So, my sports motif in this video falls flat on its face, because no sports story involves an athlete getting better as they get older. Except for one. And that's how I know I'm still telling a sports story, because just like Tom Brady was an anomaly in football, Cannibal Corpse is an anomaly in death metal. They made moves that should have killed them. They've grown to an age where they shouldn't be as good as they once were. They continue to have the drive and hunger to be the best long after they've proven themselves. And most of all, they've continued to overcome the odds and are still going strong today. That's why I wanted to tell this story, because it's a story that is like no other in metal. A story of a legendary band making the ultimate gamble and winning the jackpot to end all jackpots. Thanks to that fateful decision almost 30 years ago, Cannibal Corpse went from being death metal legends to being a death metal dynasty. Metal is dramatic as fuck, man.